75% of Americans would now vote for a gay person. That's a big change from 10 years ago.
Yep.
60% would vote for a Muslim. 58% would vote for an atheist. Socialist, 47. It's at the very bottom of the ballot. They hear socialist, they think herpes, Bernie. We have to get
but
this.
then what we do. Congress voted for $1 trillion in tax breaks for the richest people in this country and the largest corporations. That's a giveaway. We just increased military spending with very little discussion. I don't know if you know this, by $80 billion. Military industrial complex.
Including the Democrats.
Pardon me?
The Democrats vote for it too.
Yes, absolutely correct. Absolutely right. All right.
But that's socialism, the military. That's crony socialism.
Well, that's
right.
Crony capitalism.
But the military isn't capitalism. That's the government.
No, but it's who owns the military industrial complexes.
Bill Maher has just taken aim at Bernie Sanders in a sharp and very public on-air critique, and he definitely wasn't holding back. Sanders has been back in the spotlight once again, pushing his familiar democratic socialist message, and Maher wastes no time pointing out what he sees as the flaws in that approach. With his usual mix of sarcasm and blunt commentary, he goes straight at the core of Bernie's arguments, challenging the ideas head-on in a way that's both cutting and unapologetic. If you're interested in political clashes like this, make sure to subscribe and let's break it all down.
When he ran in 2020, Bernie Sanders said he would legalize marijuana on his first day as president, but that the business of selling pot would be awarded first to those who suffered most from the drug war. And you know what? I can't argue with that instinct. The drug war has been a horrendous instrument of prejudice and punishment for racial minorities. So it seems fair that they jumped the line for weed franchises the way Indians did for casinos. But it's also what's holding up Republican support for legalizing weed nationally, which would be good for everybody. And these are the hard, practical choices the Democrats have to weigh. Redress the past, or reach out to the gettable white voter who says, you know what, I'd like a shot at getting in the pot business.
Bill Maher isn't really going after Bernie Sanders for supporting marijuana legalization itself, but more for how the policy is being framed, especially the reported idea of giving Latino entrepreneurs priority access to early cannabis business opportunities, which has already sparked criticism from Republicans who see it as politically divisive and potentially unfair. Maher's bigger point is that the modern left often puts identity considerations ahead of practical policy design, and in his view, if a policy needs a demographic breakdown just to be explained, it raises serious questions about how workable and fair it actually is in practice.
For example, Bernie Sanders, his big thing was always bringing single-payer health care to our country of 340 million. But when liberal, tie-dyed Vermont tried to do it for a population of 626,000, it collapsed like that poor fuck in the Oval Office last week. Bernie, AOC, Mandani are not Democrats. They'll be the first to tell you that. They're democratic socialists, and that's a very different thing, and I don't think people know that yet.
Then turns to Bernie Sanders' support for single-payer healthcare and delivers a sharp critique built around skepticism and sarcasm. His main point is that if this idea was ever going to succeed, it should have worked in Vermont Sanders' home state, with a small population and a strongly liberal base. Yet even there it faced serious cost concerns and practical challenges. For Maher, that failure is not a small detail, but the central argument suggesting that if a policy struggles in its most favorable conditions, scaling it nationwide becomes a far bigger risk. Ultimately, his jab is that the idea may sound appealing in theory, but real-world logistics and costs often tell a very different story.
If we move toward a Medicare for all single-payer program, which guarantees health care to all people, it would cost a lot of money. That's true. But what they forget to tell you is it would be much more cost-effective than the dysfunctional system we have right now, which is the most expensive per capita on earth.
But it couldn't even work in your home state of Vermont. They were going to institute it, and the governor said, it's going to cost too much money. We just can't do it. It would be the entire budget.
No, well...
That's true.
Well, I'm not the governor of the state of Vermont. I'm the senator from the state of Vermont.
This is where critics say the contradiction becomes difficult to ignore. Vermont, often seen as the kind of progressive stronghold that would naturally embrace single-payer healthcare, ultimately stepped back once the cost projections became too high to justify the plan. For skeptics, that raises a simple but uncomfortable question. If a small liberal state with every political advantage struggled to make it work, how realistic is it to scale the same system across the entire United States? Sanders continues to present single-payer as a long-term cost-saving solution, but opponents frequently point to Vermont as the moment where the theory collided with financial reality. And as they like to put it, math doesn't adjust itself for political goals.
The question is, Bill, you tell me, why is it that every other major country on earth,
I will tell you why.
Yeah.
Because they control both ends of it. If you're saying that the government is going to pick up the tab, but not make the insurance companies, the hospitals, and the doctors not gouge people,
right,
then we are going to break the budget. It has to work both ways.
Exactly.
And okay, so then
here's an example.
So you're going to make the hospitals do that? You're going to because that
the
is
United
socialist.
States is the only major country on earth that allows private insurance companies to make huge profits in the healthcare system.
Right.
The function of healthcare should be to provide quality care to all people, not to make huge profits for the drug company.
And that leads to one of the hardest questions behind any universal healthcare system. Even if coverage is guaranteed, the real challenge is who stops hospitals, drug companies, and providers from gaming the system. Maher's point is that without strict cost controls and real enforcement, the same incentives that drive high costs today don't disappear. They just adjust with inflated prices, extra billing, and unnecessary procedures becoming more common when someone else is paying. In the end, a system meant to reduce costs can end up turning into a larger bureaucracy, with rising expenses forcing governments into tough choices like higher taxes, reduced services, or tighter restrictions that can make care slower or harder to access. So critics argue the real issue isn't compassion, but incentives, because good intentions alone are not a cost control strategy.
Defund the police or military in the streets. Either MAGA's crypto crony capitalism or city-run grocery stores. No, I don't want that. I want a Democrat who reassures me if you like your Whole Foods, you can keep your Whole Foods. Governor-elect Spanberger once said about Biden's presidency that, quote, nobody elected him to be FDR. They elected him to be normal. Normal. You know, at this year's DSA convention, or as it's commonly known, Comic-Con, get this, you had to submit a photo of a negative COVID test to get in 2025. Yeah, no one wants to do that shit again.
Maher also argues that one of Bernie Sanders' political challenges is his perceived comfort with the more extreme edges of progressive or woke politics. In his view, Sanders isn't just a hard sell to Republicans, but increasingly a complicated figure for mainstream Democrats as well. The argument is that while many left-leaning voters do want reform, they don't necessarily want constant ideological framing or purity tests attached to basic demands like lower costs and more efficient government. From Maher's perspective, Sanders sometimes comes across less like a candidate trying to broaden his appeal and more like someone speaking to a highly specific activist audience, which may energize supporters but doesn't always translate into wider electoral success. The broader point he's making is that winning elections usually depends on expanding the coalition, not just reinforcing the base that already agrees with you.
DSA are radicals about this concept, and radical economic policy is always ineluctably married to radical social policy. Their platform, for example, calls for completely open borders. They're for what Biden was doing, but more. You think you're going to win an election on that? This just seems like more extremism at a time when Americans are begging both parties, please, could just one of you act normal?
Then turns to immigration and criticizes what he sees as Bernie Sanders' softer approach, arguing that while immigration itself is not the issue, the real concern is whether the system actually enforces its own rules. Critics often highlight asylum claims with limited documentation visa, overstays that go largely unchecked, and sanctuary policies that can complicate deportation processes. Maher's point is that a country cannot run an immigration system on slogans or assumptions. It requires clear rules, consistent enforcement, and a sense of fairness for both citizens and legal immigrants. Otherwise, trust in the system erodes, frustration grows, and the issue becomes even more politically volatile.
We want to deal with the grotesque level of income and wealth inequality in America. Very few people think it is acceptable or moral that the top 1/10 of 1% owns almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%. that we have seen a proliferate.
But see, Bernie, you always say that, and I think even the Republicans are not for income inequality. They hear that, but it doesn't compute that that's going to be solved by socialism. Socialism is the programs they already like. They like Social Security. That's socialism. They like Medicare. They like the VA. They like the military.
No, that's exactly right.
Maher's broader point is that America already runs a mixed system with programs like SNAP, Medicaid, Social Security, and VA benefits, providing real support within a capitalist framework. So the debate isn't about having social safety nets, but about how far you expand them. He argues that targeted fixes are very different from trying to redesign the entire economy around a sweeping ideological vision. And critics of full-scale socialism often point to countries like Venezuela as warnings about what happens when state control expands faster than economic reality. In his view, the smarter approach is simple. Strengthen what works, fix what's broken, but don't try to rebuild the whole system on ideology alone.
75% of Americans would now vote for a gay person. That's a big change from 10 years ago.
Yep.
60% would vote for a Muslim. 58% would vote for an atheist. Socialist, 47. It's at the very bottom of the barrel. They hear socialist, they think herpes, Bernie. We have to get this.
A lot of Americans remain skeptical of socialism because they believe it sounds better in theory than it works in reality. Critics argue that heavy government control can reduce efficiency, slow innovation, and weaken incentives, which over time may lead to slower growth, fewer opportunities, and economic stagnation. There is also concern about centralization, where decisions about access and supply shift to bureaucracy, often creating delays, shortages, and less choice, which is why many people don't reject safety nets themselves, but instead resist the idea of turning everyday life into a highly regulated system, defined by waiting lists, rules, and limited flexibility.
The Congress voted for $1 trillion in tax breaks for the richest people in this country and the largest corporations. That's a giveaway. We just increased military spending with very little discussion. I don't know if you know this, by $80 billion. Military industrial complex.
Including the Democrats.
Pardon me?
The Democrats vote for it too.
Yes, absolutely correct. Absolutely right. All right.
But that's socialism, the military. That's crony socialism.
Well, that's
right.
Crony capitalism.
But the military isn't capitalism. That's the government.
No, but it's who owns the military industrial complexes.
That is where the debate ultimately lands for critics like Bill Maher. The point is not rejecting social programs or reform, but questioning whether large political promises can survive real-world implementation across issues like healthcare, immigration, and economic policy. The concern remains. The same ideas may sound compelling in theory, but still need to function in practice and deliver measurable results. Many Americans are open to change, but they also expect accountability, efficiency, and affordability. So the argument becomes less about stopping reform and more about making sure it is practical, sustainable, and actually improves the system instead of creating new problems in the process.
The American people believe that the largest corporations and the wealthiest people who today are doing phenomenally well while the middle class shrinks, do people believe they should be asked to pay more in taxes? The American people say yes.
Okay. But now this has been studied. The amount of tax revenue that we would get just from taxing the people who, I think your fans think you're talking about, the people who own a yacht, does not come close to covering what you want to pay for.
That brings the tax debate to its core. Critics argue that simply raising taxes on the wealthy does not automatically solve deeper economic problems. And the real issue is how effectively government manages the money it already collects, despite billions in public funding. Concerns about waste delays and inefficiency continue to surface with projects like California's high-speed rail and Boston's Big Dig, often cited as examples of major cost overruns and slow progress, along with broader issues like fraud and improper payments. The argument from this perspective is simple before asking for more revenue. Government should first prove it can deliver consistent and efficient results with what it already has, and that's the real debate happening right now, and it's far from over. This is Debate Storm. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure you subscribe, drop a like, and share your thoughts in the comments because your opinion is part of this conversation. Stay sharp, stay questioning, and I'll see you in the next one.